Hi, this is Dr. Claire, and this is our lecture on the respiratory system. So gas exchange is a really important process for all organisms. Most of the time, organisms need oxygen to go through cellular respiration to turn chemicals into energy that they can use to power their cells, and they produce carbon dioxide. Plants do this. Plants also go through photosynthesis and actually take in carbon dioxide, turn it into carbon-based molecules, and release oxygen as a byproduct, which we talked about in our lectures on plants. But for animals, no, there are no photosynthetic animals, so all animals need to bring in oxygen into their bodies and need to get carbon dioxide out. And so that process is a really important process for animals to survive. So in order to talk about gas exchange, the most important concept is actually the concept of diffusion. Now, diffusion is just the random movement of molecules down a concentration gradient. We did talk about diffusion when we talked about osmosis in the plant lecture. And basically diffusion is just, it's a naturally occurring process that has to do with the laws of entropy. All molecules are just kind of randomly moving at all times, and so over time they end up evenly distributed across a space. So whenever you have a higher concentration of a molecule in one area than you do in another, it will diffuse down the concentration gradient. So it will diffuse from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So diffusion is really important for gas exchange because that's how these respiratory gases get in and out of the body. It has to diffuse. And you can't rely on diffusion alone when you're a really large organism like ourselves. So we have to have ways to make diffusion work better in order to be able to get the gases that we need in and the gases that we don't need out. So in order to talk about the concentration, because when you're talking about concentration, when you're talking about diffusion, you're talking about gases moving down a concentration gradient. We have to talk a little bit about how to talk about the concentration in gases. It's pretty obvious when you're talking about concentrations in a liquid, because you can just measure the amount of a solid that's dissolved into a liquid. But gases are a little bit different. The concentration of the gas depends on the pressure that the gas is under. So when the gas is under a higher pressure, the molecules in that gas are going to be closer together, and therefore they're going to be at a higher concentration. So when we're looking at the atmosphere, for example, we often talk about the partial pressure of a particular gas, and that has to do with both the air pressure that you're at. So if you're at sea level, the air pressure is about 760 millimeters mercury. That's how it's measured. It has to do with how much liquid mercury it can displace. And that's the total air pressure. So that's all of the gases that are in the air. But if you want to know about oxygen, for example, oxygen is about 21% of the gas in the air. And so the partial pressure of oxygen is the total pressure times that percentage. So times 0.209. And that gives you the partial pressure of oxygen at sea level. Now, of course, here in Colorado, we are not at sea level. So the total air pressure is actually less. When you go up in elevation, those molecules get further apart and there's less air pressure. The concentration of oxygen is still the same. We still have about 21% oxygen, but the reason it's hard to breathe is not because there's a smaller percentage of oxygen, it's still 20%. It's just that there's less air altogether. And so the partial pressure of oxygen actually goes down because the total air pressure goes down. Okay, that kind of makes sense? All right. So that's how we talk about concentration in gases. So animals need to get these gases in, they need to get those waste gases out, and they do that through diffusion. And so you have to think of ways to maximize the diffusion rate in the body. There's a number of different ways that animals can maximize diffusion rate. One is actually if they are an air-breathing mammal versus a water-breathing mammal. Air has a lot more oxygen in it than water does. On this planet, air is about 20% oxygen, as I just said. In water, there's a much smaller amount. It's about 0.4% oxygen in the water. So there's really way less oxygen in water. In addition, diffusion happens much more rapidly in air than in water. So if you imagine something stinky in one corner of a room, it does not take very long for that stink to diffuse all the way to the other side of the room. Whereas if you imagine a tank of water and you drop some food coloring into one side, it's going to take a long time for that food coloring to diffuse all the way to the other side of the tank. In fact, it's going to take about 8,000 times longer than it does for that same distance to diffuse in the air. So things diffuse faster in air. Also, if you are moving something over your respiratory surfaces, it's much easier to move air than water. And you can think about that. If you wave your arm through the air, it's really easy. If you put your arm in the water and you wave it back and forth, that's much harder. There's more inertia in water and it requires more energy to move that water. So for all of these reasons, it's much easier to get oxygen out of the air than it is to get oxygen out of water. If you are an aquatic dwelling organism and you have to get your oxygen from the water, the best thing to do is to live in cold water. And the reason for that is that the water dissolves gases better when it's cold. They can hold a larger content of gases. So if you think about your can of soda, when it's nice and cold, the carbon dioxide doesn't go out too quickly. It does bubble out, right? But it doesn't bubble out super quickly. If you think about a warm can of soda, it goes flat really fast. That's because the water in that can of soda cannot hold that carbon dioxide. All of it bubbles out, and you end up with flat soda. Cold water holds more oxygen than warm water. And at the same time, when an animal actually warms up, that increases its metabolic rate, so it needs more oxygen. So you have this double whammy of the animal needs more oxygen when it's warm, and the water doesn't hold as much oxygen when it's warm. So animals generally do much better in cold water than they do in warm water. This is one of the concerns with global warming, is streams becoming warmer and not being as good habitat for many of the fishes that we like to catch, like trout and bass. Okay, another thing you can do to maximize diffusion is to have a lot of surface area over which that diffusion can occur. So if you look at the respiratory structures of a lot of animals, they're very convoluted. They have all these little curves and dumps, and that greatly increases the surface area. So if you have more surface area that's exposed to the gas, then you're going to be able to diffuse more of it into the body. All right, so we have a few examples here. Some aquatic organisms have external gills. These are the feathery gills on a newt. Internal gills, fish and also things like lobsters have internal gills. And then if you're an air-breathing animal, you might have lungs or tracheae. Again, in each of these cases, they've got many branches, many little convolutions that are increasing the surface area. And then finally, to increase diffusion, you need to maximize the concentration gradient. So you need to have a big difference happen between the air or water that you're trying to get the gas out of and the body. And so you can do that in a couple of different ways. You can do that by you increase the concentration gradient by having a very short distance that the gas has to travel. So if you look at the lining of the lungs or the surface of the gill, it's a very thin tissue that allows diffusion to happen very quickly because the water doesn't have to travel very far. Also ventilation, so moving the source of the gases over the respiratory surfaces. So in the case of a air-breathing animal, you move air in and out of your lungs. In the case of a water-breathing animal, it's going to move over the surface of the gills. So that's called ventilation. And then also perfusion, or the circulating of blood over the respiratory surfaces. So both of those are going to keep the concentration gradient high by bringing in either fresh air or fresh water, and then also by moving the blood across so that as the blood gets oxygen into it, it moves away from that area so that blood that needs oxygen can come in. That's the perfusion. Okay? All right. So let's take a look at some respiratory structures. We'll start with an aquatic respiratory structure, gills. Fish use gills extensively, and they have actually what's called a countercurrent flow in the gill. What that means is that the water is flowing one way across the gill and the blood is flowing the other way. Generally in fish, the gills are within the mouth. They're supported kind of just by the side of the head, and water will flow in through the mouth of the fish, across the gills and out the gill flaps. So if you see, fish, they've got these little gill flaps that are fluttering along like this, right? So that's the way that the water moves. And water really only moves in one direction through a fish's respiratory system. It goes in the mouth and out over the gills. Okay, so they never breathe back out through their mouth. All right, so if we take a closer look at the gills, again, we see this pattern of a lot of surface area. So they've got the gill arch, and then each gill arch has many little filaments, and then those filaments have little ridges on them called lamellae. And the lamellae are where the gas exchange is actually occurring. So the water is flowing in one direction across the lamellae, and the blood is flowing in the other direction. So why is that important? Why is that countercurrent flow important? Well, it has to do with keeping the concentration gradient up, so that oxygen can diffuse from the water into the fish. So take a look at what happens if, we'll start here on the right side. This is what we would call concurrent exchange. So if the fish had water flowing in the same direction as the blood, what you would see is when the water entered the gills, it would have very high oxygen concentration. The blood would have very low oxygen concentration. So diffusion is going to go from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Oxygen is going to diffuse into the blood. That's great. So you go along as these two vessels are next to each other. The water is going the same way as the blood, and the oxygen keeps moving into the blood until you get to a point where you have an equal amount of oxygen in the water as you do in the blood. That's going to be about a 50-50 mix. Then, once you get to that point, you can't go any further. You won't have any more net diffusion of oxygen into the blood because the concentrations are equal. So you can only get 50% of the oxygen out of the water if you have the vessels running the same direction. Now, let's take a look at when the vessels run opposite directions, when you have countercurrent flow. So now, the water is entering up here at the top, the blood is entering down here at the bottom. Where the water enters, it has very high oxygen concentrations because it's coming in fresh water from the ocean. Where the blood enters down here at the bottom, it has very low oxygen concentrations. It's coming from the body. It's just dropped off all of its oxygen. And so what you see is that at every point where they are passing each other, the blood and the water, going in opposite directions, there's more oxygen in the water than there is in the blood. So what that allows is for diffusion to occur across the whole length. And even at the bottom here, where there's relatively little oxygen left in the water, there's only about 15% oxygen left in the water at this point. This is the blood that's just entered. It has almost no oxygen. So the oxygen levels are still higher in the water, so you can still have diffusion of oxygen into the blood. So that's why the countercurrent exchange is really good. It's a very efficient way of getting oxygen out of the water, and that's really important because there's just not that much oxygen in the water to begin with. So that's why fish need a really efficient way to get it out. Okay? All right, let's take a look at lungs. So that was a water-breathing animal. If you are an air-breathing animal, you've got some different problems to deal with. Air is less supportive than water, so if you look at fish gills in the air, they collapse, and you lose all of that nice surface area. And so they don't function out of the water, which is why fish do not survive when you take them out and into air, because there may be more oxygen in the air, but they can't. When their gills collapse like that, they now don't have enough surface area to exchange the gases with the air. Also, if you were trying to do like a unidirectional thing like the fish do, where you would, like, let's say we had like gills here on the sides of our necks, if we breathe in air and try and pass that over the gills, what's going to happen to the gills? They're going to get really dried out and crunchy, right? So we need to have a way that minimizes water loss as well. And so lungs are they're supported within the body, and they have a structure that allows the surface area to be maintained. They also, because we breathe in and out with the two-flow system, you don't lose as much water as you would otherwise. Okay? So that's why you have lungs when you're an air-breathing animal. So basically, if you look at the lungs, again, we want to maximize the surface area over which gas exchange can occur. So you take in air through your trachea, that splits into two bronchi, and then further splits into smaller tubes called bronchioles, and those bronchioles eventually end in little bubbles called the alveoli. And the alveoli is where gas exchanges occurs. And these you have thousands and thousands of these little alveoli. Each alveoli is surrounded by a net of capillaries with blood flowing through them, and so the oxygen will diffuse from the alveoli into those capillaries, and then carbon dioxide will diffuse from the capillaries into the alveoli so that you can breathe it out. All right, it's a very, very short distance across which that gas exchange has to occur. So this is what the alveoli look like up close. Very, very narrow membranes separating the blood from the air pocket within, and then a lot of surface area. And so you have that gas exchange going back and forth between those smallest blood vessels and the alveoli themselves. All right. So in mammals, when we breathe, we have a muscular system that allows us to breathe. We have a diaphragm, which kind of covers the bottom of the thoracic cavity in which the lungs are contained. And then we have a set of intercostal muscles that are between our ribs. And when we breathe in, those muscles contract. When those muscles contract, the diaphragm moves down, and the intercostals lift the ribs up and out. That increases the volume of our rib cage. And so when we increase the volume of our rib cage, it lowers the air pressure in our lungs, and air is sucked in through our mouth. Then when those muscles relax, the diaphragm comes up, the ribs settle down, and then the air is expelled out because it lowers that volume of the thoracic cavity, increases the air pressure in there, and pushes the air out. Okay? You can also contract your abdominal muscles and some different intercostal muscles to force air out. So when you cough or sneeze or talk or sing, you're actually actively contracting those muscles to push the air out in a controlled manner. Okay? But when you're relaxed, exhalation happens when the muscles relax. So when you're just sitting there breathing calmly, you contract your muscles to breathe in, and then when the muscles stop contracting, you breathe out. Okay? All right, that's how mammals breathe. Let's take a look at how birds breathe, because birds are a little bit different and really interesting. I'm a bird person, so of course I think birds are interesting. But birds have a very complex respiratory system with a number of air sacs. Gas exchange does not happen in the air sacs. Gas exchange still happens in the lungs, but the air sacs move the air around the body of the bird in a slightly more complex pattern. So they've got posterior air sacs towards the back of the body, anterior air sacs towards the front of the body, and they have their lungs. So what happens when a bird breathes in is the first thing that happens is it goes to the posterior air sac. So it goes to the air sacs at the back of the body. Then when they breathe out, it moves from those posterior air sacs into the lungs. And this is unique because unlike mammals where we breathe in and out the same entryway into our lungs, birds actually have a unidirectional flow across the lung. The air enters in one side of the lung and it leaves out the other side of the lung. This means that they can extract oxygen more efficiently from the air than we can, because when we breathe in and out through the same opening, some air is still left in the lungs even when we get to the end of the breath. And that air is going to be low in oxygen, and so there's some stale air that's there, so it's not as efficient. The birds having this unidirectional flow is much more efficient. So it moves in from the posterior air sacs into the lungs, and then when the bird breathes in again, it leaves the lung, goes into the anterior air sac, and then when the bird breathes out a second time, it finally leaves the bird. So it takes 2 breaths for a chunk of air to move through the whole bird. Now, while the air is moving out from the lung into the anterior air sac on the inhalation, it's simultaneously moving from the mouth into the posterior air sacs. So both things are happening at the same time. So that's how birds breathe, and that allows them to get a lot more oxygen out of the air, which allows them to have a very energetic activity, flight, which would be very difficult for a mammal to maintain because we wouldn't be able to get enough oxygen to sustain our flight muscles. So that's what allows for flight to occur. Another animal that breathes air but does not have lungs is insects. Insects do not actually pump air in and out of their bodies in the same way that we do, but they do have what's called a tracheal system, which is an interconnected web of tubes that kind of spreads throughout their body. They've got little spiracles along the sides of their body. So insects do not breathe through their mouth. They breathe through the spiracles that are along the sides of their body. And those spiracles open into this tracheal system, and gas exchange happens through those tracheae and air capillaries within the insect. So again, it's greatly increasing the surface area like any of these respiratory systems, but it's just a different way of setting it up. It is somewhat less efficient than vertebrate respiratory systems, which is part of the reason why insects tend to be smaller than vertebrates. There is a upper limit to which this system can allow an organism to get. They can't, it's not efficient enough to have insects that are really, really big. I mean, there are some insects that are pretty big, but they're not like huge, all right? And that's what they're limited by. All right, that's my lecture on the respiratory system. Catch you next time.